Nothing.
All right. Well,
got any insight? No, sorry, you go ahead.
No, please let us know about your shirt. What's the importance of your shirt?
I thought you could tell me.
Oh, well, it's a network graph. It looks like it's all the nodes are connected to all the other nodes. It's also, what is it? It's the geometry terms are escaping me right now, but it is a very beautiful shirt. Where's it from? Is it just like a?
I have no geometry for it. I got it at a bar, like clothing swap, and then I rushed off with one beer in me to go and do delivery driving. And the house that I drove to, it ended up being a really far, like, Uber Eats drive. This some years ago, and the house that I showed up at was like a 20-minute drive out. I was pissed the whole time, and the guy had this, in like a huge sticker of this on the back of his Jeep. Right after I put it on.
Okay.
So, synchronicity power.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll have to research it a little bit better after this talk. I'm definitely interested in those kinds of graphs to some extent. All right. So maybe we can start with explaining what the general form of Ethereum localism is, and then we can get into open protocols and executions, and then how they relate to legal engineering and this inverted precedent, which I personally, at reading open protocols and executions, or at least open protocols, see a lot of similarities with this legal engineering innovation. So please let us know what the GFEL is and what you all do there.
Yeah, so it's the General Forum on Ethereum Localism. It's a conference we sort of threw together ad hoc last year. We had a big, we had worked together with this friend of ours in town and had been building out this warehouse space, building it out as a community space. It's since gone under, as community spaces tend to do. But we had this huge space, and I just, a lot of the sort of Ethereum and decentralized web enthusiasts in town had just linked together, and it seemed like a good idea to throw together and talk about, what our main interest was, which was like, how do you apply these principles of the decentralized web to the city, and what could it do to help urban spaces, and all that good stuff about the meta crisis and regenerative finance, etc. Very different vision, I'd say, last year than this year, because we've been through a season of it. But yeah, I like last year, it was very deliberately advertised as sort of throw the meme out and just as a provocation, leave it open-ended. Come and discuss your vision of Ethereum localism, whatever that is. This year, I think we've honed down a little more in this idea of sort of identifying a structural resonance between what goes on like in the Ethereum space and what goes on in cities, which is kind of what we'll get into today a little bit. That's like sort of, we're drifting towards that theme, or at least that's one suggested theme. Yeah, and so anyways, it's a 3-day event. Had great attendance last year. We had 2 pre-conference days leading up where we went to an eco village, had a work day at a farm, saw 2 different maker spaces, and yeah, just did like a lot of sort of touring the city beforehand. And then there was a bunch of hangers on for the 2 or 3 days after. Actually, it felt like a week after. And it ended up being just like a really great sort of networking event, but networking in the way of like, by way of sort of exploring the city together. And so I hope we can sort of replicate that this year. So yeah, it's September 13th to 15th. Tickets are live on the Ethereal Forest Twitter. Yeah.
Great, yeah, and that's in Portland, Oregon, and I was there last year, and One thing that I really liked about it is we had a lot of fun. We also did a lot of work together. So it was, to me, very, very productive, but just very low key and enjoyable also. And the best kind of unconference in my mind. I don't know if you would call it unconference. I guess things were kind of booked, but I don't know. I just a lot of productivity happened out of it. I guess maybe I'm thinking that because of Ethereal Forest and the inverted cities. Is that the name of the first? Yeah. And so, yeah, maybe if you can speak a little bit about that publication. I don't know if it's still ongoing or what your thoughts are there, but I definitely appreciated it.
Yeah, yeah, Kyle contributed and then threw something in there, and yeah, it was just sort of just following that open-ended theme of different ways to think about sort of bioregionalism and localism. A really thin zine, understated. I mean, I think that's why the conference was so great, because we hadn't Bread Chain threw us some cash, but in terms of larger actual corporate sponsorship, there was nothing like that. And I think that's what Ethereal Forest is sort of trying to represent, is that I say underground not to just be pretentious, but I've really been thinking about that term a lot, and sort of the underground element, or the underground roots of Ethereum. I think that's what we're trying to embody with both that in-city zine and with the forum.
And also, was the MyCoFi book, did that come out of the event?
Yeah, I think that it had been, I believe that it was actually coined, the term was coined as a joke at the Collaborative Finance Conference with Julio and Felix and Scott Morris out there. And it's near and dear to Jeff Emmett's heart. And they were outside on the porch just hanging out, drinking coffee, and I think it was a conversation between Owaki and Emmett that led to the book that came out. So it was very generous. There was a bunch of stuff like that ended up happening. It seems like it was flowering out in all directions. So hoping that happens again this year. Yeah,
definitely. I would, a few publications and what have you. There was some magic there, and there's some magic here, by the way, also. So it's too bad you couldn't attend this time around, but I do hope to get you out to some zoo event at some point. We'll see. In any case, why don't we go into now what an open protocol is, and then maybe we could start. Up to you, but maybe we should start with extitutions, because that's a concept that's been fleshed out by a few groups at this point, so it might be a little bit more kind of understood. But it's up to you how you want to present these two concepts.
Yeah, I think I'll start with open protocols. So I did a talk on this earlier this summer for Local DAO Summer. And so I have some slides that I'm not going to go through the talk at all. I really want to keep it Q&A and conversational with you. But I'll just be flipping around a little bit between these slides, because they illustrate some key stuff that I think is a little more intuitive that way. So let me just pull this up. Yeah. So, I haven't heard the term open protocol that much to talk about web protocols, but it is that is what people go to when they hear the term. And that may just be we picked the wrong neologism or something, but let's see. Is that okay? But it should, I just wanted to clarify, this is an important point to clarify, right? What do we mean when we say open protocols? This is all, again, I should say this is the research sort of vectors of the Open Protocol Research Group, which is a subsection of Ethereal Forest. That's me and Van here, and our friend Max Wolford. And so we've been thinking a lot about the nature of this question of Ethereum localism, this question of sort of onboarding, the impression that a lot of people who are doing the work of onboarding, it's really easy to go to what I take to be like almost an Uberification model, which is like just capture the network effects, and once we get that, we'll change the world. And it's not just that there's some critiques of that. I'm all for it if we can onboard a bunch of people to do a QF round or something in town. But what we found is that there's not a great, especially in Portland, there's just not a great public opinion of crypto right now. It is what it is. So for some good reason, some sort of total misimpressions. But it provokes it pushed us in the direction of something that was much more interesting, I think. And that was to try to think of, rather than just patching on problems, hey, your nonprofit should sell NFTs, to think at a deeper level of the structural resonance, right, between the decentralized web and peer-to-peer type systems that are sort of possible, or were made, to use the technical word, made hegemonic in the age of the web, and what sort of existed in the city that fit that. So just to preface that, but and when we're talking about open protocols in this sense, it was meant to describe what where that structural resonance is. So really, open protocol it's almost a redundant term, or the term open has sort of has two senses. I sort of wanted to point out protocols are by nature sort of open, right? A protocol is something that's refined down to a mimetic and reproducible formula, or a form, so that it can circulate easily. So really, there's not the idea of a closed protocol in this respect is maybe incoherent. So by this, it's yes, of course we mean open as in mimetic, reproducible, but that's on the technical side. The important part, and the part that is what we're sort of trying to underline by emphasizing open and open protocol, is this part right here, which is the cultural element, right? We just said the word here, empiricism, the empirical thrust, right? And that's meant in the broad sense, not in the sense of the scientific method, but in the sense of just exploratory, experimental, and experiential emphasis, right? So the classic example I always give is when the military is testing LSD, for the purposes of, psychological warfare. It's using protocols, and it's using a technical protocol of, this particular chemical combination that makes up LSD. When the merry pranksters, that's a protocol, right? When the merry pranksters are going around and giving out this, and teaching people about this drug, and giving it out and handing it to people and saying, free your mind, and explore yourself, that's what makes it an open protocol. In other words, it has this cultural accompaniment that makes it, fundamentally different from these other protocols. It has this push and this gesture towards empiricism and openness. And I like to think of that as a sort of cultural programming, if that makes sense. Just to sort of bring home the analogy to the sort of decentralized web, right? This is another, we don't have to go through all of this. This is something I talked about in much more detail in the talk, but this comes from a phrase Michael Zargum told me, which is that he says, blockchain is durable prefiguration. And so I like to think of open protocols as being in this sort of prefigurative circle, right? Instead of operating on a representational plane, that is, I guess, it's useful is the meme that circulates a lot in this space about infinite games. I think that's what's going on with this prefigurative circle. There's not some telos or some teleological end. It's just this sort of self-serving, self-spinning circle that splits between this sort of culturally programmed empirical imagination here, and then the evolving technical protocol, whatever it is. And just to sort of hammer that home a little bit, just again to emphasize that what an open protocol is really like a technical protocol that's accompanied by cultural impetus to open empiricism. And so this is just a little another sort of graphic to give a sense of what's meant here by open empiricism, because I don't know that that's necessarily intuitive, right? I won't read through each one, but you can sort of see what's going on here. This last part about subject-object versus intersubjective is really important, right?
Yeah, can you speak a little bit to that one? These other ones are terms I think that are relatively well understood, but subject, object, and then intersubjective. Would you say intersubjective is kind of more relativistic, or what are other kind of points of reference maybe that can...
Yeah, well, it strikes me, I mean, what we're really searching for here, and what I think, Ven and I especially, we got on the same page early on, that the thing that's important about Ethereum and about the sort of, decentralized web is that it allows for like constructing legitimacy, constructing repeatable relationships outside of institutions. And when we're getting to like the sort of philosophical sense that we were sort of living on, what that really means is that, or one major element of that is that institutions sort of privilege and in some ways impose. I don't want to be glossy with that, but I think it's fair to say that that bureaucracies require sort of stable subject-object relationships. In other words, they work by filtering through clearly defined individuals and objects without a lot of room for representing entanglement or representing sort of network. Yeah, like I don't want to say network effects, but representing network effects, representing entanglement, representing things like atmosphere that are really hard to sort of define or enumerate, but when you actually pay attention to the way people live, are incredibly important. So open empiricism and the sort of, what would you say, like the non-institutional or extitutional abilities of protocols, that they're able to sort of coordinate behavior without institutional enclosure. It tends to be, we found in our research, tends to be permissive to these more intersubjective senses. That means fluid sense of individuality. You're here at the concert. Oh wait, now you feel like you're part of the crowd. There's this sort of anonymity to it. The recognition that certain things that are being produced in certain circumstances are a product of more flows between the individuals present than any one individual present. So yeah, I mean, I think these are like intersubjective, right? The idea would be that open empiricism is able to get on that plane and to explore and define and build practical like moving concepts around more intersubjective or more complex and entangled terms than just subject and objects. Yeah.
And then so bringing this into legal engineering.
Okay.
Bureaucratic, to me, that seems like legal, but also protocol seems like legal. So I know we haven't spoken so much about what legal engineering is, so feel free to ask me some clarifying questions about what I'm talking about when I say legal engineering. But do you believe, I mean, I personally do believe this, but anyway, do you believe that legal engineers can develop, for lack of a better word, bureaucratic systems that are open empiricism? Or at least protocols, maybe that's a better way to say it. Can we have intersubjective lawyers? I guess might be a more straightforward way to ask that.
I mean, that Ven, what you got? Jump in.
I mean, I could say that legal engineering could definitely play a part in engineering forms that are conducive to open empiricism, much more than they are conducive to the tendency of captured empiricism. So in that way, they could play a pretty large part.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a sort of whole other element of this, which is a little bit just too speculative to I thought was too speculative to try to get into here at all. But I'll just briefly mention it. You know, it comes from the work of David Graeber, who we all know, or I think a lot of people in this community are familiar with him by way of the book on rent and bullshit jobs. He has, you know, he talks a lot about structural violence in the sense of implied violence that bureaucracies often sort of weld, or is, you know, and when I think of law, I think of ultimately the threat of legitimate force that sort of underpins it, even if the sort of, you know, even if the end of law is to mediate without recourse to violence, it seems clear that the means to that end is, you know, welding the implicit threat of legitimate force. Graeber talks about how people when you find yourself in a bureaucratic situation, a heavily bureaucratic situation, everybody gets dumber. And, you know, I mean, he sort of has some charming anecdotes about it, about sort of trying to fill out some paperwork after his mother's death. But what he's really trying to argue is that when there's violence in the room, people's ability to like occupy higher level like parts of themselves is like foreclosed upon. And I think that's represented here pretty well. Like, you could say that the presence of violence you know, inspires rigid subject-object relationships, whereas peaceful situations inspire intersubjective relationships. And that sort of goes up across the board here. Think about, you know, freedom for sort of creative divergence versus a sense of compulsory convergent thinking. You know, I think that it's clear to me that what you guys are thinking about in the context of Zuzulu and thinking of legal engineering there, and that just what LexDAO is doing in general is not, you know, not beholden to that, because the code as law discussion has the potential to leave that problematic, but I haven't dived deep enough into it. So in other words, my answer would be, you know, to the extent that it's able to circumvent that necessary appeal to legitimate force, then I can see a lot of ways that it could work on this side of the spectrum.
Yeah, I guess I have one of my motivations inviting you is that I hope that at least enough of legal engineering develops on this open empiricism side of because it seems to be how Ethereum works. And looking at, to me, the first legal engineer, at least the first proper legal engineer inventor of the 20th century is Charles Goldfarb. He made HTML, markup language. And from that, we got HTML. So we got the internet, that protocol, right? Tim Berners-Lee's protocol, W3C, was originally, a legal engineer that was documents that are easily queryable. So that's more on the library side of things. But yeah, I guess where would you put a library? Like I say, even a community library, would you put that on the protocols for going and retrieving a book and then returning that book so that people can use that? I know that there's these libraries that people have just in front of their houses. I think the house in Portland that is open to our community, I think there's one of those little books there. Yeah, where would you thinking about that relationship with legal engineering? In other words, it's really lawyers are there to help people understand their roles with each other, to communicate better with each other, and to help de-escalate if people start having disputes with each other. That relationship, because what I heard just then was basically state violence and lawyers are that's what is the association. But maybe what are your thoughts?
No, you know, I mean, like I said, I perfectly willing or very interested in trying to think the notion of the law outside of outside of the appeal to legitimate force, right? Yeah, super interested in that. Yeah, I mean, well, first I want to say that that I believe when this was told, like, anyways, there's an organization in town called City Repair, and our research group actually just did like a 2-hour interview, or this was over a month ago, but a 2-hour interview with the sort of founder, Mark Lakeman, who I believe is responsible, or he's either responsible for that notion of these tiny neighborhood libraries itself, or at least the sort of iteration in town that you see all over when you walk around, among a lot of other cool stuff. I mean, actually, there's something quite relevant about the work that he did, which is, I'd say it's worth dropping that anecdote as quick as possible. Just that he was trying to figure out. He's an architect, right? And he was informed by permaculture principles, and so he had City Repair is built around, the organization sort of originates from this idea of building these intersection, like neighborhood intersection, just sort of collaborative common spaces, right? So they would paint they would paint an intersection, like in a little sort of more suburban part of the city, and they would set up a bench, and they would plant some things. They'd set up a little library, and so these some parking cop comes by, and the next thing you know, there's a police officer there, and they're like standing there like, dude, you're breaking 40 laws, right? Like, and he basically says, fuck off, like, come back and tell me to tear it down. I dare you, right? Or tell us to tear it down, right? This community that just, the kid, 3 generations of people out there building it. And eventually, after like a 3-month battle, the mayor came and gave them an across-the-board amnesty on the many, many infrastructural laws that they had broken. Basically saying, if government can't help or facilitate something like this, then what are we even for? So there's something, just kind of an interesting little anecdote about law. But there's another point. The question that you were asking originally points to the execution frame, and sort of on the way to that is, this last talk was mainly, although I'm not getting into it here much, was mainly focused on this idea of underground protocols, or what I call the protocol underground. And what happened there was that when we were looking to like interesting cases where protocols existed, we realized that actually the most interesting, the communities that made the most use of protocols, and they were the most sort of like notable use cases of it, were communities that were illegal or so illicit, that had been made, whose practices had been made illegal, protocols and practices that had been made illegal, or had been made so illicit as to be practically illegal, right? So I just wanted to note that a big case study that I had was of Spiral Tribe, which was a collective that sprouted up in 1994 in light of this very controversial and obviously culturally prejudiced act banning raves, this Criminal Justice and Public Order Act in 1994. The premise being that if your practice that your community centered around is made illegal, LSD is another good example, then you can't just build a brick and mortar. You have to protocolize, right? So this like rave practice that these guys had developed had become protocolized. This little quote here I won't read, but is sort of relevant. If you look to sort of pacifist communities that thought really hard about protocolizing rather than institutionalizing, they often are dealing with something illegal, and that's worth noting. Well, I want to give you a second to respond, but I don't think I fully answered your previous question about like tool libraries and things like that. But that's something that
we're flowing into the topics that we want as well. So we're not necessarily stuck on the questions. I'm enjoying this. Yeah. So, I mean, like our firm, Exeunt, we are operating in a special economic zone because what we're practicing, that kind of law, is illegal in pretty much all other jurisdictions at this point. And it's because of something that made sense historically in our case, which is that lawyers shouldn't be doing products, because if lawyers are just servicing product companies, then they're not going to do like corporate espionage, or when less likely to do that kind of where you rely on someone else, you expose yourself a lot to the other person, and then they take advantage of you. So lawyers are engaged with people in really vulnerable states, and that's why legal ethics and especially conflict of interest, those kinds of concepts have developed. It's really important that they do. But what the flip side has been, as we switch in intellectual labor and outsource it onto machines, is that we haven't been automating the law like the other intellectual pursuits have been doing. And so legal fees are incredibly exorbitant. And then the basic due process rights, like access to a public defender and a speedy enough trial, all those things are just, we're not providing them, even in the bureaucratic kind of closed protocol methodology. So the state itself is becoming more and more illegal in relationship to its own standards. So that's at least what I'm seeing is kind of a decaying society where the state is more and more being kind of hypocritical in its expression. And, you know, that's obviously my spicy take there, but definitely our firm has had to practice law, be quote unquote illegal. And there are examples of people like Mahatma Gandhi, and, you know, throughout time, that law is in a lot of ways an area where people who are very learned can disagree, and strongly disagree, and it doesn't necessarily devolve into kinetic communication. It can actually stay fairly high level. So this inverted precedent thing that we'll get to a little bit later, it's realizing how much the powers that be, that the Supreme Court method of majority concurring and dissent allows for high level thinking with very powerful forces in not having agreement, but being able to sufficiently reconcile and modify over time as the powerful forces ebb and wane in relationship to each other because of this majority concurring and dissenting, and then also well expressed reasons, not just the outcome. And so basically with the inverted precedent, we're taking that, we're going, well, it doesn't have to be the top of the pyramid that enjoys that. We can have that be each leaf in the node enjoying that. So committees, for instance, especially executional committees, where you've got a person from one organization, a person from another organization, and say a third, and they're allocating resources with grants, something like that. And they will come from very different worldviews, and they can still make decisions relatively quickly using the precedential system. So I'll go over that in a little bit more detail later, but yeah, that's basically where I'm coming from. So, and then also the concepts of law being the most perfect laws are ones that you can't break at all. Like we can't break the law of gravity. There's just no way. So it doesn't really matter. There's not a law that is imperfect and requires some kind of enforcement to maintain that fiction. At least this is where I'm personally coming from. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this goes to Josh Stark's great paper. What is it? Atoms, Institutions, Blockchains. What I thought was brilliant about that paper, if I remember it right, was there are those laws that like you said are just have this immovable quality to them, but the idea of building other institutions or other sort of like legal structures or just structures of hardness that sort of make creative reference to thermodynamics, right? Right. That's the sort of that's my vision of what crypto represents, is the sort of exit out of the problem of legitimate force, is appealing to other forms of hardness in creative sort of engineering You know, the other thing that you're making me think of is I know that there's, I think some people in this space also sort of avert their eyes when they see anything about French theory, but Jacques Derrida's structure, sign, and play paper starts out with this idea of, you know, the center is not the center, right? Basically drawing this idea of a society with a sovereign in the center, that everything that sort of emanates from the sovereign is subject to those laws, but the sovereign is sort of absent from that system in the sense that he's not subject to those laws, right? He's the exception. And it seems like what you're talking about is almost decentering that exceptionalism and having that moment of exception be a sort of floating and negotiating, like a displaced and floating and the negotiating sort of dynamic element of the legal structure, which, like, of course that's illegal. Like, I mean, you know, or of course experimenting with something like that is legal, but it's amazing that, you know, I mean, it's forcing, or I see it forcing in the next few decades, really clear conversations about when is legitimate force, about this question of legitimate force. And anyways, so
well, I do want to emphasize that is, I think, really important because that is the hope of distributed ledger technology, especially separating money from state. I mean, we haven't been able to do that up to this point, but with distributed ledger and money just being ones and zeros now, purely information, we can have something that is not capturable in physical space. So kinetic is not really there, and it's all ultimately telecoms that's providing this. So communication over vast distances, and then the mathematics, cryptography. But key to and encouraging people who have to, you know, pay their food and stuff to run their machines and maintain these databases. That has been a legal engineering technology, smart contracts. So their contract law is really interesting because it's just going, well, what does it mean to have two people who have obligations to each other, and how do we negotiate with that on a basic level for all different kinds of communities? And so the three principles it's consideration, consensus ad idem, so that's basically like informed consent, and then so both parties know what they're actually doing. Consideration is that there's some value that goes to one party, and bidirectional. There's also value that goes to the other party, and then the third one is privity. So the contracting parties, the parties are actually making that legal relationship with each other, peer to peer. That's where it stays. So you've got two peers that do it. They can't say this third person over here has any relationship to that law, unless that party brings value in and gets value out. And then there's concepts like legal seals, where you do enough formality and then you can have unidirectional value go in. And so for sovereigns, that's really useful because a privy seal can say, okay, if somebody attacks your country, my army will go in and defend. And so that's where unilateral contractual relationships can be really valuable. But yeah, so smart contracts, right? I mean, that's why every time you pay gas on Ethereum, you're maintaining the system. And that's because we took programming language and took this legal concept, this jurisprudential information innovation, really. So outside of actually managing people, but really just on a theoretical kind of Platonic area of law, and then so constrained programming language to have to do consideration. And so that's why every time something is executed on these virtual machines, that somebody gets paid for that execution. And so that then so far has very successfully maintained the machine. And if you look at, it's much more expensive than IPFS, but also I have much more faith that if I put something on the EVM RPC, that IPFS is then IPFS, that is going to be there in 500 years, right? And so those are just legal concepts that are applied, but they're ones that are alternatives to the use of force. But it definitely that kind of scaffolding or kind of crystalline substrate that we call protocols often. Thoughts on that?
That was moving a little too quick. Like it's a jargon set that I'm a little bit outside of, but just the broad outlines make a lot of sense to me. It sounds like yeah, just sort of technical, more technical explanations of intuitions that I had about what's actually going on. But I have to say that, like, man, I'm glad that I've already learned so much from this conversation, because just that thought of, a lot of times it's the broad stroke concept of these, whatever, like the conceptual bedfellows or something, that is really the stirring thing, less than any specific application of it. That it's just sort of like, okay, well, there's something to think about. What is law absent legitimate force? Yeah.
It is a legitimate force. It's just not a kinetic legitimate force. So like entropic force is a legitimate force. That's an emergent legitimate force that in pop culture we've said is disorder, which it's actually directing towards highest probability state, which is path of least resistance also. And so if you've got solid objects like cubes and you do entropic like jiggling with them, they then become well ordered because that does offer the higher probability state. And again, that force, and it's a legitimate force because it's a force of physics. It's actually an emergent force. It doesn't have, it's not like the strong force or weak force, nuclear forces. And so that's what we've got here with the smart contract distributed ledger technology. It's a legitimate force. No one can turn it off because there's computers all around the world running it, and not one group has the force, whether legitimate or illegitimate, to turn that off. So then then we can engage with legitimate forces that heretofore haven't really been available, like, for instance, the possibility of separating money from state, or just the meme what you were talking about before, is just having something, a meme proliferate, or certain legal relationships between parties proliferate, and then that's there. So because it's done with code. Now code, like civil code, that's law, right? So one of the things I'm doing is I'm looking at these words code and law, and I'm seeing them used in various areas, and I'm saying, well, they're used in various areas because they actually are the same fundamental phenomenon. And so one of the things I'm kind of confused about when I have conversations with most people is this kind of separation. When people talk about law, they're talking about litigation. Well, in the UK, that's not even called lawyer, really. It's called barristers often. They're specialized in a particular area of law. Yeah, I mean, we're calling it code, we're calling it law. And so there must be some commonality between them all, even though their expressions at this point in history, might make them look very different. But perhaps in future stages of history, they reconcile more so. At least that's for me why I'm a legal engineer, right? So I see a lot of law being engineering, and it could be social engineering, or it can be computer engineering, but it really is wordsmithery, and Smiths are engineers, right?
Well, actually, man, I'm not going to get into it, but I just want to point. I'll just bring it up real quick that there's a whole slide here on maker metaphysics. So I think that's I definitely see this. You're definitely that archetype, Kyle. But look, there's a bunch of stuff that's resonating with the institutions part. Instead of trying to be systematic, I'll just sort of jump around with the enthusiasm. One thing that's really interesting, though, is your opposing. I don't want to say that there's a necessary. Well, I don't know. We could talk through it. The relationship is peculiar, though, but for what you're describing, which is there's something about your account of blockchain or your account of the distributed ledger that implies an antagonism, like it anticipates actors that would be trying to censor or impose or enclose in some respect. It brings up the very first sort of vision of executions that came up was something about a conversation with a conversation with this friend of mine who friend of a friend who was in sort of a somewhat famous indie band from the 90s, right? And he was telling us about record labels, and he's basically saying, yeah, like we made like 25 record labels in, like, you know, maybe that's an exaggeration, but he was like, we just made them like all the time, like we were just getting them out, like who gives a shit, right? It's like the point wasn't to build a successful business. The point, it didn't correspond to any like traditional economic game theory at all. There were just sort of building these structures that were meant to that were devices for flight, right? It was to keep the scene from being co-opted. It was like to like we need this logistical role to be filled. We know that the alternative is to have that logistical role filled by types of businesses or institutions that are going to have a corrosive, presence in the scene. So we'll post this up. None of us want to be, none of us want to own a business. None of us wants to be a chief financial officer, but we'll, eat out this label, and it'll dissolve 6 months later, and we won't give it, we'll say fuck it and make another one a few months after that. That seemed to me to be the first and the first vision, or that was the first vision that sort of inspired Exeutions. It's a decent time to mention that that executional theory, or I think executional studies, it existed beforehand, but at least in this space, Jesse Kate Shingler and Primavera de Filippi were the ones who got that conversation going. I think that what we're doing is, or that the term execution is a little bit distinct from what they're talking about. They're talking about the sort of underside of institutional relationships, and we're sort of pushing it to more of an extreme to talk about institution-like bodies that are serving a purpose that is sort of rather than in the service of enclosure or capture or sort of brand imperialism or something like this, is in the service of keeping that open empiricism, right? Keeping that prefigurative circle. We're making music. It involves using fucking instruments and keeping a imaginative, uncaptured, eye on the end in itself of like creativity and creative iteration. And in order to preserve that, we need to keep the scene rich, but we also need to set up sort of temporary strongholds that, we argued, we would say they wear, executions wear institutional masks, right? They often take the form of traditional institutions, but if you study their behavior, you see that it's not a good way to describe them. It's not a good analytic frame for what they're actually doing. I think you may find this interesting. I don't think I'm exposing any information unduly, since it's long since resolved, but we stopped by, when the three of us were in San Francisco, we stopped by the anarchist bookstore and ended up sort of having a long, what sort of turned into an informal interview with the person who was there, not the owner, because it just run as a sort of as a council. But we're asking him about, what's the ownership structure, and he says, well, it's not really a worker cooperative. It's not really this. It's not really a nonprofit, although we all volunteer. It's not really a worker cooperative, although we all democratically manage it. Someone told us a while to make it an LLC, and he's telling us the only reason we did that is because we didn't pay taxes for 27 years, right? And then all this, this is old San Francisco, right? You could just get away with it. And then at some point, that conversation came up, and so they slapped this bare minimum legal status on top of it, and said, what we're doing doesn't correspond to any traditional form, nor need it. It had very much it had DAO energy. So let me take it a couple little steps further, just to say that the original sort of inspiration for what an execution is, with like in relation to an open protocol, is meant to sort of mimic or be, again, structurally resonant with the relationship of DAOs to protocols, right? Ethereum is an open value network. There's no marketing office of Ethereum. 4 people get together and sort of want to serve something approximating that role. They bootstrap themselves. Eventually, maybe one or another autonomous grants organization, or maybe the Ethereum Foundation, which in some ways is an autonomous grants organization, throws them some money. Next thing you know, they're filling that role. This feels to me like an executional relationship, or these feel to me like in their own right executions. And so it's not just a coincidence that that DAOs are demanding this ability to maneuver and sort of embody under really experimental organizational frames, because that's sort of what executions demand, right? They don't correspond to the traditional legible legal frames for what organizations are. Seem to me to, in general, have an implicit logic of enclosure and capture, and a sort of a kind of rivalrous or imperialist relationship with the world, right? Things that are entities that are trying to relate to these by nature open structures, they have to explore different ways. And in that, again, this is this prefiguration that in itself has to do with this open empirical imagination. It's like there's this emanating, like, addictive or viral contagious element to the openness that means that everything that interacts with it on the same page has to fundamentally, like, challenge all, say, both their form and their content. I have two, as we move forward, you know what, I'm just going to give one quick further example, because it really resonates, or it's resonant in some way with what you were talking about with consent. I'm also just now seeing that the time is getting nigh.
So
Sorry.
Time, yeah. Well, this has been great. Yeah, so anyway, I could speak with you for a whole nother hour, but yeah, we're close to time, so let's.
Yeah, well, I just it's worth just popping in for 30 seconds if possible. This is the Society of Janus in San Francisco. This is another sort of maybe provoking a conversation for next time or for later for y'all. This was a collective of S&M enthusiasts in the 70s who got together and saw that there was this protocol circulating of sadomasochism that, again, was protocolized rather than institutionalized because it was illegal, because of its relationship with the gay community at the time, or at least in many places it was legal. And what did they do? They formalized a set of practices or set of assumptions around consent, right? In order to say that if we want to keep this open, if we want to keep it with this open empiricism, then it has to have these foundational assumptions, and we're not going to impose them, but we're going to contribute to the sort of community conversation about it, these set of practices in the form of these manuals. And that's another great sort of concept for me of an execution, is something that is filling this role of trying to standardize the cultural practices that make an open protocol open. So the legal engineering element of that.
Well, actually, I can give you a great example of legal engineering. We'll get into it in a later session today for the audience. But yeah, so HATS protocol, that's org chart control system. And it's a control system, right? So that seemed kind of a little funky, I guess, on the bureaucratic side, but it's not use of force control. It's cryptographic, and you've got your private key, and everyone has their little secrets, each private key, and zero knowledge, because your secret is the private key. You can just prove you have that over and over again, and that's your signature. And that's how the control system works. So with Hatch protocol, with the clinic, one of the first innovations I've done is create a consent system. So somebody joins the clinic, and we remove the liability, basically in some sense executional liability, but it's permissionless liability. So the fact that we have our org chart public that anyone can use, then other people can say, hey, you can enter our club because you're a director in this company. They can just do that, right? Well, then we kick someone out of the directorship, then there's where the a problem can arise, right? Because other people would go in and say, hey, we're gonna or the same person can be like, I just lost this right from a third party, the one that didn't have any privity at all. And yeah,
we have another session that's starting right now.
Okay, yeah. So we're gonna have to finish up here, but we were 5 minutes late, so maybe if you can just be a little bit relaxed. Yeah, so basically it's mutual consent. So somebody joins and they say, yep, okay, we're going to sign this agreement. Basically says this whole new area of liability, we're not going to impose that on you. And then the organization itself consents as well. So there's one hat for your consent, and there's one hat for my consent. And that's consensus ad idem, right? So that's the fundamental principle of contract law and why smart contracts exist. Right, well,
there's a really neat paradox there where paradoxically the things that are traditionally illegal are those things that may inspire the work that you're talking about here. So really great stuff. Yeah, sorry, I hope I wasn't rambling too much, but this is a great talk. So
thank you, Exeunt. It's Glenn who's next. So
got it.
Yeah, all right, ciao.
Cheers, Kyle. Thanks a lot.
Sorry. Cool.